a confident partner in Latin America. An interview with the president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa.
President Correa, you're visiting Berlin. I don't imagine you've had much time for sightseeing, but what do you think of the city?
The city is beautiful. I know Germany, but I'm not familiar with Berlin. I was here back when there were 2 German states. I studied in Belgium and backpacked around. This time we've had some beautiful spring days. Berlin is a beautiful city. Even though our program has been very full, going to the German parliament and walking through the streets is also sightseeing.
How was your meeting with Chancellor Angela Merkel?
Of course, the language is a barrier, but she's very direct, just like me. When I asked her a question, she gave me a straight answer. And we did ask each other the appropriate questions.
I'm sure you spoke about the Eurozone crisis. You're also an economist. Germany has advocated strict austerity measures. Did you talk about that? And did you suggest any alternatives, or do you agree with what Europe is doing?
We only spoke a little bit about that, about how she saw the euro crisis. She's optimistic and thinks the reforms should continue despite the enormous sacrifices. I'm a bit more skeptical. I say that with all due respect. I would never wish to interfere with the independence, autonomy, or sovereignty of Germany or Europe, but I think some mistakes are being made. History has taught us many lessons. Take the Great Depression in the U.S. President Hoover employed the same policies, and they made the crisis worse. That's why the term Hoover's policies is used to refer to austerity. In Latin America, we're crisis experts, not just because we've studied crises, like me as an economist, but because we've suffered through them. And we know the IMF's austerity recipes inside out. What they basically do is protect financial capital. They don't create growth or jobs. That would be the efficient and the humane way to overcome the crisis. So I'm a bit more skeptical, but of course I respect the decisions that Germany and Europe have made.
According to the IMF, Latin America will experience economic growth next year, and Ecuador will be among the countries that experience the strongest growth. One of the reasons you're here is to seek investors. What sort of investment are you looking for from Germany?
I'm very happy to hear this from the IMF, because we've been doing exactly the opposite of what the IMF has been telling Latin American states to do. In the 6 years I've been president, we haven't had a single visit from an IMF delegation. If they come as tourists, they're more than welcome. But if they want to come with a sovereign attitude like in the past, we'll put them back on the plane. What worries us is that these bureaucrats have made such an impression on Europe. As I've said, we're experts when it comes to crisis. The IMF hasn't tried to solve this crisis at the lowest possible cost for the people. Instead, it's tried to guarantee that private debts are repaid and to safeguard financial capital. Our relationship with Germany involves more than investment and commerce, but they are important. We welcome all foreign investment. But the investment itself is not the big issue. A good project will always attract investment. But what we value most as a developing country is technology transfer. So the sort of investment we're most interested in is the kind that brings new technologies.
You're probably aware, Mr. President, that some investors and businesses don't think that Ecuador is 100% safe when it comes to investment and would prefer to put their money into other countries. There are concerns Ecuador could, at some stage, change its taxation laws or that foreign companies could be dispossessed, like in Bolivia or Argentina. What guarantees can you give investors?
That's a shame. If investors expect me to mortgage the country to give you this assurance, then we politely decline and advise them to look elsewhere. The rules of the game are clear. The Constitution prohibits the seizure of private property and guarantees legal certainty. Our new production regulations even establish an investment contract. We have a range of incentives for high-quality investments which foster added value and technological transfer. These are already enshrined in the law, but an additional contract is being drawn up to demonstrate these incentives, like tax reductions, although those are already legally enshrined. There are also arbitration clauses, which are now fair and just, not like in previous cases when they were written up to appease investors who complained about the lack of legal security in our countries. Tell me, what company has lost money in Latin America? There are many who abuse the states. For example, there's the famous economic equilibrium of contracts. When the Ecuadorian oil contracts were signed, the price for a barrel of oil was $16. We received between $4 and $5 a barrel. Then the price rose to $50 and $60, but still we got between $4 and $5. No company came forward and said, the economic equilibrium of the contract has been destroyed, to my benefit. Had the price of oil fallen, they would have immediately taken the contract through arbitration, which always rules in the company's favor.
There's a long-term project. In a few years, you want to end Ecuador's reliance on fossil fuels and replace it entirely with hydroelectricity. What is striking is the volume of investment coming from China. You almost get the impression that China is buying up Ecuador, which would make it reliant on Chinese money.
Back when 60% of our foreign trade was concentrated in the U.S., and we got nothing in return, no financing, nothing, no one made it an issue. Now that we're diversifying our trade partners and financing sources, suddenly we're reliant on China. That's just not true. The fact is, Ecuador is one of the most important investment centers in Latin America. Besides China, we have investors from Russia, Brazil, Europe, the United States. But what's the issue in the hydroelectric sector? Normally, to take part in the tendering process, you need financial support, and China provides its firms with the money to do this. If Europe gave its companies similar financial resources, maybe they would be the ones to win the bids. But you've brought up an important topic. We're changing the electricity system. When we took office, hydroelectricity, that is, clean, renewable energy, represented 40% of the sector. The rest came from thermal energy, fossil fuels, dirty power, and about 7 to 8% was imported. Can you imagine? We were importing energy. In 2016, we'll be exporting energy. Right now, we're working on 8 hydroelectric projects, and soon we'll have the cleanest and most efficient electricity network in the world, with 93% hydropower.
Ecuador is one of the world's so-called green lungs. Part of the country's oil reserves is located in Yasuni National Park. 3 years ago, you said that if the international community paid Ecuador half of the profits that could be made from the oil, then you would not exploit those reserves, but the money required to avoid extracting the oil, between $3.5 and $3.6 billion, has not been forthcoming. What's going to happen now?
We announced the idea 5 years ago, and unfortunately, many people didn't understand it. It was a progressive and logical idea, but some saw it as a threat. If we don't pay them, they'll mine the oil. Why make threats when it's financially more advantageous to simply mine the oil? You've said it. Ecuador is making the biggest contribution. We're only asking for half of what we would otherwise receive, $3.6 billion from the international community, mostly from countries with the highest emissions. But it means Ecuador would forego the other $3.6 billion, which we could certainly use. We would get more from extracting the oil. Taking part in the fight against climate change is a great sacrifice for us. But you're right, the expectation was not met. In June, we'll conduct a thorough evaluation, then make decisions.
There's one position you're well known for, and I'll just quote this. There's a fundamental contradiction when private for-profit companies devote themselves to the public good and social communication, end quote. Where is the contradiction? Why can't the private sector be a player on the media landscape and be independent, like in other countries?
Well, of course it happens in every land. It's one of the worst problems of the 21st century, the vulnerability of society. What we believe, what we don't know, what we think about people we don't even know, or what you think about me, what a couple of private companies say about me. When there's a contradiction between profit and the quality of information, profit will win out. How do you stop that? It's a latent problem, a major problem. The only way to stop it is by being extremely ethical and professional, and with the democratization of the media.
con mucha ética, con mucho profesionalismo, con democratización de los medios de comunicación.
But wouldn't the citizens who decide if the information is objective or manipulated notice that professionalism?
Vamos, Carlos, por favor, usted para tomar decisiones.
Come on, Carlos, you need information to make decisions. Information about the people producing that information. The contradiction is the gulf between profit and information. There's a danger of manipulation. So how can you solve that problem? With ethics, professionalism, and democratizing the media. But what we have in Latin America is the antithesis of all that. Media that belong to oligarchical families. Their strategy has always been to build an empire of banking, industry, and media, but not in order to inform, but to defend their economic empire. That means there are no ethics. Of course, there are always exceptions, but generally speaking, there are no ethics, there's no professionalism, and there's a concentration of ownership.
There's so much more to say there.
Yes, it's fascinating. There are a few issues where I found as many contradictions as the debate over freedom of speech, and the fear of calling things what they are. When I criticize media companies, it's as if I'm attacking the right to free speech. But when someone criticizes me as the president, they're not attacking democracy. It's absurd. We can't let ourselves be so afraid.
Mr. President, your last term has just begun. It's a bit early to be taking stock, but things move fast in politics. Can we rule out amending the Constitution to allow you to run again? Your popularity rating is around 70%.
Even if some people say the opposite, we believe our system in Ecuador is just as good and democratic as that in the USA, so we don't want to change it.
President Correa, thanks very much.
Thank you, Carlos.